Timing cover gaskets are a very common thing to fail on the 3-liter Duratec V6 in the Ford Escape and Mazda Tribute. This one's a 2001. There are videos on how to do it, or at least one very good one I found. But nowhere could I find any information about how long it takes to do the job, or at the very least, what has to come off and what has to be done. If you watch this video and decide you want to take on this project yourself, here is the link to the video I watched for a step-by-step breakdown. It took me 41 hours of wrench time to do this job. Now, I did this job under pretty much the worst of all possible circumstances. I did this job by myself, outside, during the winter, during a rainy spell, on a semi-paved surface at my friend's house, without any air tools. I just disconnected the battery. I'm gonna pull out the elbow here and the EGR valve here. And these cables, I'm gonna get all this stuff out of the way because the manifold's gonna have to come out. Both valve covers have to come off, and I use zip ties to hang the hose out of the way for the front valve cover. Okay, now I've jacked the car up and supported it, and I've pulled the wheel off. I've pulled the nut out to separate the drive axle. You also have to pull the suspension bolts here out and the castle nut for the tie rod out. Separate that out, and then 2 nuts here. The CV axle just slides right out. And I'm doing that because the alternator is going to have to come out. The person in the video I watched said it can go out through the top over the valve cover, but it looks like you have to take the covers off to do that, and I don't want to sprinkle a bunch of crap in there. And you know what? It'll give me more room. As you can see, I need it. I've got the alternator free, and I took the bracket out. There are 3 bolts here, 1 up there, and 1 further back. And that'll give me a lot more room to clean the timing cover gasket sealing surfaces. One thing I want to mention before I forget is that you need to keep your bolts and fasteners and hardware super organized. And the way I'm doing that is putting them in bags and labeling what they go to. And a couple of these bags will end up with maybe 1 or 2 fasteners in them. Now that may sound excessive, but trust me on this, I've done that before, throwing everything into one pan, and it makes the job a lot harder later on. I have to remove the engine mount here, so I supported the engine using a block of wood on a jack under the oil pan. Got my engine mount bracket out, and I had to take off this power steering line, which drips a little bit, so put a pan under there. And then I undid the bracket, which bolts on top of the mount, and it just flops back here. I've got it in a bag wrapped in a paper towel and tape the neck here so that it doesn't just drip all over the place. Once I get that mount out, I'll have a lot more access to the pulleys and the timing cover on the engine. Now time to remove the crankshaft pulley, also known as the harmonic balancer. Most people do this with an impact gun. I don't have one, so I'm going to use a kind of non-standard trick to get this off. I've got my socket on a ratchet with a cheater bar on the ground, and I'm gonna go reconnect the battery. I've got the positive from the alternator and the wiring connector from the alternator protected inside rubber up here so they don't short. I'm gonna reconnect the battery, and I'm gonna bump the ignition, bump the starter, and that will turn the engine while this holds the bolt and break it free. One thing I really need to stress again, if you're going to do this, be sure you have the positive terminal from the alternator isolated and insulated so it doesn't short. Okay, so now I'm gonna put my positive terminal on because I know I've isolated it. Now I'm just gonna bump the starter. Here we go. Oh, and it's a dead battery, that's fun. I'm not gonna take the time to recharge the battery right now. I'll do that when the car's done. So I'm gonna do another way. I've got a pry bar here with a bolt that goes into the crankshaft here. So now that that's wedged between the bolt and the socket, I should be able to grab my cheater bar and break it loose that way. Now to pull the crank pulley off. You can do quote non-standard procedures to do this. You can, try and pry it gently a little bit and turn it. But you can also get a puller set from Harbor Freight for less than 20 bucks. So that's what I did. The puller pulls on these 3 bolt holes and you have to clean these because they rust and get very dirty. It actually took me quite a while to get these clean, but you have to clean it. Otherwise you could really mess it up. There we go, got my puller on, and this particular one has a 14mm head on it, so I've got my socket here, and I'm just gonna tighten on that until the pulley comes off. And there we go. Now the last thing I have to pull out is the tensioner assembly, which is on the timing cover. I could take that out with it out of the car, but I decided to go ahead and do it with it in the car so I don't have to kind of wrangle with the timing cover. I don't want to mess up the sealing surfaces. It's a 10mm, and it doesn't have enough clearance between it and the frame rail to accommodate a ratchet all the way out. So I got it out as far as it would go with the ratchet, when the ratchet could still come out. And then there's just enough head that I can get to with a combination wrench, and I'm going to do that to get it the rest of the way out. All that's left to do now is unhook your camshaft position sensor right here and go around the timing cover and pull all these bolts out here in the V and around the timing cover. And then you've also got 2 bolts that go up into it from the oil pan, and it should just come right off. Just kidding, there's one more thing. The crankshaft position sensor right here, that has to be disconnected. I just took the valve covers off. I unbolted them early in the project, but I didn't take them off until now because all the work I was doing around here, I didn't want to knock any dirt down into the engine. So yeah, that's done now. So now that that's done, I can pop the timing cover off, which I've already unbolted, and it should just be a matter of kind of pushing gently out on it. Emphasis on gently, and don't push against things like the timing chain or anything sensitive. I just realized I'm going to need to pull the cruise control module up to get the timing cover out. And there we have it. There's the timing cover and the leaky gaskets. Now I got to clean everything up to put the car back together. Now that it's out of the car, I'm going to pull out my crankshaft position sensor and my camshaft position sensor. The new gaskets come with a crankshaft seal, which is this. So I'm going to pull all that off, and then I'm going to clean this up really well and then reassemble it so I can go back into the car. One last thing I need to do before reassembling it is pulling the oil pan off, because that pushes against the timing cover. So obviously I'm gonna have to drain the oil out of it, but I'm also gonna have to suspend the engine, and there's not really, it's the oil pan is what's holding the engine up at the moment because the mount's gone. So what I think I'm gonna do is see if there's room to feed it through the wheel well here and up into it, and then put the mount back on to hold the engine, pull the jack out, and then I can pull it out. That's the idea. Let's see if it works. So it looks like I can feed it up through the bottom. I'm just gonna pull it up. I'm gonna need both hands to do it, but I'm gonna pull it up just to make sure the concept makes sense. But so far it looks like this is doable. Looks like that idea is a go. As you can see, I got it up from the bottom. That way I can suspend the engine from its mount again, so I can pull the jack out, so I can pull the pan out. Okay, so I've got my mount and my bracket back in. I didn't tighten those bolts and nuts. I just threaded them on there. But yeah, now the engine is supported once again by its bracket. I could pull the jack out, and now I can get the oil pan out. And I'm gonna wait to get the oil out of it. My thinking is that the dirt that falls in there can, you know, kind of sit in the oil, and when I drain it, hopefully it'll take that dirt with it, you know, just so it's not sitting in the engine. So yeah, that's pretty much it for this part. I'll come back tomorrow, and oh, apparently my beloved pen light is done being a pen light, and now it's just garbage, which sucks. I really love this thing. I've had it for about 1.5 years. Well, whatever. I've used it hard, dropped it a bunch, and it was only 20 bucks, but I'll get one at Harbor Freight. My work here for the night, however, is done. I just finished cleaning up my sealing surfaces, clean them up really well, and then clean them again with brake cleaner once you've gotten all the gasket material off. And you are going to need to use some gasket sealer for where the parts of the engine come together. So we've got here where the head and the block come together, same on the other side of the V, and then further down you have where these two parts come together. Here and here. And then once you've got your timing cover back on, you'll need to use a little bit more where the oil pan meets the timing cover, and also where the valve cover gaskets meet the timing cover. Now I'm ready to get the timing cover prepped and put gaskets on it. So I just sprayed some brake cleaner in these channels here for it. I'm going to kind of wipe down the flat surfaces and then use Q-tips to get in there to try and get whatever stuff in there I can out of there. There we are. I've got my seals in. And if you're not sure which ones go where, there are these little tabs that go into these little places on the timing cover, which helps you figure out what goes where. Another thing, and this is something I really like, is these gaskets fit into the timing cover grooves really, really snugly. I've had so many times where I've had to put something on and gaskets were slipping around or popping off or whatever, but these feel like they'll have no trouble staying in place as I'm lining the cover up. So that's a really nice touch. I took pictures of the timing cover before I pulled it off, and I'm glad I did, because I couldn't remember off the top of my head where all the bolts went. The ones with the studs on them are going to go in all the holes in the V, and also another one at the very front of the engine, just under the valve cover. Now I have all of my timing cover bolts in and snug and not tightened. I've got gasket sealer, and you can see a little bit of it right above where the top of my light is there, that orange stuff squeezing out. This stuff needs to set overnight, and so I just snug the bolts to hold the timing cover and the engine in contact with each other. And then when I come back, I will tighten all of the bolts before I move on to the next step. Something I just remembered is that these bolts here with the studs on them, all of them for the timing cover are 13mm heads, except for this one, which has a 10mm head for reasons I don't understand. And you know, these are 10s as well. I have such a love-hate relationship with this car. There's so many things I like about it, but just, you can't. Ford does things that don't make sense, and this is one of them. I just tightened my timing cover bolts, and now I'm going to move on to the valve covers. This is one of the bolts for the valve cover with the grommet off of it. You can see it's this kind of collar that the grommet has to slip up and over, and it is permanently attached to the bolt. So what I am doing is using a little screwdriver to kind of get under it and then push it around here to get it off. And then once I've got all of them for this valve cover off, I'm going to clean all these really well before I put my new grommets onto them. Now my valve cover is ready to go back in the car, and I'm doing the front one first. So I'm going to put some Permatex here where the timing cover meets the head, as well as right down here. And then don't forget, you have this right here that needs Permatex here and here, because this is a different piece here. This is the pulley that runs off the camshaft and drives the water pump. That's very unusual, but this is also a very unusual engine. This engine actually has quite a bit of pedigree. It started off as a Porsche design, and Porsche decided they didn't need a V6, and so they sold the rights to the engine to Ford. The engine wasn't completely finished, so to help them finish the design, Ford brought in the British rally tuner Cosworth to help them finish it up. And they went on to use this engine with the addition of variable valve timing and I think different valve lifters. I think they used a bucket style lifter, but they used this engine in Jaguars. And the previous generation Aston Martin V12 is basically just two of these engines put together. So this engine really has a lot of pedigree, and it's a very charismatic engine. I love the sound it makes. It's really tough. This car has 230,000 miles and it runs beautifully. It's just the oil was leaking down on the exhaust and causing a fire hazard. But the engine itself is really good, and you can see how clean it is. I really like this engine. It's just a pain to work on. Now it's time for the rear valve cover to go on, and I've got it ready. It took some extra cleaning for the back one. The front one had been off and cleaned, but this one I guess it either has never been off or it's been a lot longer because there was a bunch of crud down in the little grooves. So I used Q-tips and brake cleaner to clean those out really well. And then I also did the same thing for these holes right here. And I found some dirt that had sprinkled in here, just a little bit, but some dirt that had sprinkled down in here while I was pulling it off. And so I sprayed some brake cleaner back there to flush it down, and the oil pan is still off of it so it could drain down, but it left the rollers here on the followers dry, and it probably isn't that big a deal, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a spoon and some motor oil and put some oil on each roller and on each cam lobe so it's not a completely dry start when I restart the engine. Just put my coils back in, and one thing I want to mention here is use never seize or anti-seize, whatever you want to call it. The big container looks like that. I get the big container because I use a lot of this stuff. I've had this thing for like a year and it almost looks like I haven't used any. You can also buy individual packs of the stuff though, but be sure you put some of that stuff on here because these things are notorious for corroding and sticking and snapping later on. Another thing is when you tighten it, just give it what I call the wrist twist. You know, give it a good firm twist with your wrist, but don't like really yank on the wrench because that's another sure way to break your bolts. Now I'm gonna put the intake manifold in. This is my friend's car and she's kind of on a budget right now, so these intake manifold gaskets here, standard practice is to change them, but they're actually fairly new. And it's also really easy to get to these on the top of the engine. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take them out, I'm going to clean the channels they sit in, and then I'm going to flip them over to give them a new sealing surface. And here I am at the end of yet another day, and there's still a lot to do. I have to put the oil pan back on the bottom, suspend the engine from the bottom again so I can pull this back out so I can get to this end to get a few more things put on there, the tensioner, the power steering pump and stuff like that. And I got to put the crank pulley down in the bottom and then put all this crap back together. So there's still a lot to do, but you know, it's there's a lot that's done now that wasn't done when I woke up this morning. This job is a lot like eating an elephant. There's no way you're going to get it done in one sitting. Just kind of take one bite, chew, take another bite, chew, and just keep on going. I got my oil pan all cleaned up and the new gasket is sitting on it and ready to go in. Now, one thing I really like about this gasket design is that the silicone goes around the bolts, so you can put the bolts up in there and it holds them in place. And that's really nice because I took pictures of where all the bolts go and I put them where they're supposed to go. So all I got to do now is put some Permatex where the timing cover meets the block and put the oil pan up under it and start the bolts. And I'll snug them down, I'll let them sit overnight, and then I'll come back and I'll tighten them up. Now that the pan bolts are torqued down, I'm ready to put my exhaust back up, and I just tried to do it, but this bracket wouldn't go on because this stud on here was blocking it. So this one needs to have one of the bolts without the stud on it. I took pictures before I did this and I thought I had everything back where it originally was, but obviously I was wrong. There we go, that did the trick. So now I'm gonna go back around and get the back one done first and then come back up here and do these nuts. Now I'm putting the crank pulley on and I put oil around the surface that mates to the new seal. And one more thing about putting this on, this thing fits really tightly on the crankshaft. So what I did was I got it started lining up the gateway key, and then I used a block of wood and then tapped on that, rotating the block so it pushed it in evenly. And now I've got it to where I can put my bolt in and thread it in several turns, so I don't have to worry about stripping the thread. I'm gonna use that to pull the pulley all the way down till the bolt bottoms out. Now I have my pulley all the way down and I've got my bolt back out, and I didn't really think much about this before. There's some like Permatex stuff right here, and I found a little bit still stuck to the bolt, and I realized Ford used some to kind of seal the gateway key in here. I don't know how necessary that really is, but as much work as this thing's taken, I'm gonna go ahead and clean this off and just put some new Permatex on because I really don't want to have to pull this thing back apart. There's a recess where the key doesn't go all the way through, so I've used a pick tool to kind of work some of this down in there the best that I can, and then I'm going to put a little bit more right up here and then put my bolt in. I've just done a bunch of research on this crank bolt because some sources say you have to replace the bolt every time. Also, going back to that Permatex I put on the keyway, it turns out you do need to do that, so I'm glad I did it. But anyway, I found all sorts of conflicting things, and couldn't really find much on this particular engine for some reason. So what I ended up doing was torquing the bolt down to about 80 pound-feet of torque, loosening it, tightening it to about 35 pound-feet, and then most things said turn it an extra 90 degrees. I set my torque wrench to about 108 just to have it click to give me some kind of reference. I turned it about 90 degrees after the 37 pound-feet thing, and it didn't break on me or anything. Most people say they just use an impact gun to install this. Like I say, I don't have one, but I mean, you know, impact guns, in my experience, you know, I probably tightened it more than an impact gun would. But anyway, I've got my bolt in now, and I can take this out and on with the job. Now I've got my drive axle back in, and I'm hoping I don't have to take it back out to get the alternator in place here. I might. I certainly did to replace it, but I'm going to take a gamble on this and put it back in. I have not put this end into the hub, and that way, if I do have to take it back out, I can just undo those two 13mm nuts again and slide it right back out. But that'll stop it from dripping, which means I won't have to use a pan under the transmission anymore. And we'll see if this gamble pays off. And guess what? You can't put this alternator bracket bolt in with the axle in the way. Oh boy. Okay, I'll pull it back out. I pulled it out most of the way, but I'm just gonna let it sit right here. I don't wanna have to deal with moving this thing around and keeping it out of the water because it's very rainy and very muddy out here. And here we are on yet another beautiful, beautiful day. I'm glad I've got this canopy here above me because it's more than paid for itself. So I'm gonna get my cruise control module and my power steering line and stuff out of the way so that I can take this back off. I've got it supported again by the oil pan now that it's back on. And remember, these are only hand tight, so I'm going to pull this back off. It'll make it easier to install the power steering pump and a couple other things on this end of the engine. And then I'll put the mount back on and torque it down. Don't forget you have two 13mm bolts here hiding under the mount. I just realized, and I feel really dumb for not thinking about this in the disassembly stage, but what you can do to get to this bolt for the tensioner is once you have your mount and the bracket off, you can jack the engine up a little bit and then you can get a ratchet on that. Engine mount bracket is back on, and don't forget on this one you have a ground and another nut that goes down on top of it, and then your 10mm bolt here for your high pressure power steering line and this connector. I've got my cruise control module back in place, coolant bottle back in place, power steering reservoir back in place. I brought these two pieces of plywood almost as an afterthought, but I'm really glad I did because as you can see, the weather is not pleasant. And this is a semi-paved surface. There's concrete here and then two strips of concrete under each row of tires, but that doesn't leave anywhere for me to sit. So I put those down there and then cardboard on top of them, and that kind of kept the cardboard mostly out of the mud. So it quite literally saved my butt. Now it's time to put my alternator back in, and I just hooked it up. What you have to do is unbolt the alternator from its bracket and then turn it 90 degrees towards you to get to the terminal, the positive terminal, and the wiring connector on the back of it. So I've just connected those up, and then I'm going to turn it back the way it's supposed to go and bolt it up. When I replaced this alternator, I had to jack up the engine just to get the thing out and take the drive axle out. It was a total nightmare. They literally couldn't have put this alternator in a harder to reach place if they'd put it on the moon. And there we have it, a reinstalled alternator. I also just installed this bracket that holds the connector for the oxygen sensor. It's held on by one 10mm nut, and be sure to take this little clip and put it on the stud after you tighten the nut. Because if you don't, the wire here will rub against the axle and it'll eventually wear through the insulation and short it out. There's also a hole in the middle of the bottom part of the alternator here, and that probably had a clip from the factory. I'm just going to use a zip tie. Now it's time to put the drive axle back into the hub, and to do that I'm actually going to have to pop it back out. Those 213s down there have to come back out, and I've got to slide this back out. I had put it back in just to keep fluid from dripping out of the transmission. I'm going to take a pair of pliers and remove this clip for the brake line so I can free it up, because if I let the knuckle just drop right here, it's going to put a lot of stress on that brake line. There we go. I've got the brake line somewhat separated so it can move around a little more without stressing it. So now I'm going to pull the axle out. The knuckle is going to have to come apart to get this lined up to go into the transmission. So what I'm going to do is slip this bolt back out, and I'm going to use some zip ties to tether it so it can still lean and give me more room. But I don't want it to flop all the way over because it'll stress this connection right here on the brake line. There we go. So this is still kind of, it's got some slack here, and hopefully I can get my axle lined up like that. I got the part of the axle shaft that goes into the transmission cleaned with some brake cleaner, and then I laid down a paper towel here going all the way, or almost all the way to where it goes in, just in case it hits anything down there. I don't want it to pick up any dirt. Putting that paper towel down turned out to be a really good call because it's really tight going back in there. So that saved me from having to worry about dirt going into the transmission. Now time to take the axle shaft and put it into the hub. I'm gonna put some never sees onto the splines of this axle just in case I have to pull this thing back apart. I'm gonna have to jack up the other side of the car because the sway bar is pushing up on the link here, and I can't line these up. I could take out the sway bar link, but then I would have to figure out how to get that put in there. So I'm just going to jack the other side up so that the sway bar is not under torsion. Now I've got my suspension back together. I've torqued my strut bolts, my axle nut, and the castle nut for the tie rod with the cotter pin back in. All that's left to do under here now is to get my plastic splash guard for the alternator in, and it goes back through here. It clips here on behind this member here, and it shields the alternator from splashes. I have my serpentine belt back on now, and like everything else on this car, it's not straightforward. The pulley on the tensioner is bolted from the inside, from the block side. So what you have to do to get the pulley into it is take the ribbed side and hold the ribbed side against the engine, slide it up between the block and the tensioner assembly, and then turn it so that it's on the tensioner the way it should go. All that's left to do now is put my cross member back on, which goes from this side to this side and under the exhaust, which is why I had to take it out. And then I'm gonna put a new oil filter on. The engine's got no oil in it, so I'm gonna put nice fresh oil in it with a nice fresh filter. And while I'm down here and doing all this crap, I'm gonna do a drain and fill in the transmission as well. All right, moment of truth. I've got my fluids topped off: oil, transmission fluid, and coolant and power steering fluid. All right. There's a little bit of oil left on the exhaust from before when it was leaking, but the engine itself is bone dry.